EPA's 2012 Construction General Permit, or CGP. This webinar is sponsored by EPA's Office of Wastewater Management Stormwater Program. My name is John Costco with Tetra Tech, and I will be moderating the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. We'll start by going over a few housekeeping items. The materials in today's webcast have been reviewed by EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, webinar participants should be aware that if EPA statements differ slightly from the language in the permit, the language in the permit is what takes precedence. Mention of a commercial enterprise, product, or publication does not mean that EPA endorses them. If you have any technical difficulties or need technical support, there's a phone number you can call. You can call 800-263-6317. Again, that's 800-263-6317. I'd also like to briefly summarize some of the features of today's webinar. We encourage you to submit questions at any time to our speakers during this webinar. To ask a question, simply type it in the questions pane in the attendee control panel and click send. If you have any technical issues, you can let us know by entering it in the questions pane and then clicking on the send button. We'll do our best to respond to your issue by posting an answer in that same questions box. Again, you can also call the technical support number at 800-263-6317. This is essentially a repeat of the webcast that we gave last Thursday. The slides are largely the same, and we have our same two EPA speakers here today. So if you signed up for that webinar last week, the materials will essentially be the same. We've also posted a copy of the slides from last week's presentation, and there is a copy of the slides we'll be using today up on EPA's website. And that website is www.epa.gov/npdes/CGP. Again, that's epa.gov/npdes/stormwater/CGP. And we'll send out the link, the direct link to that presentation here in a minute. This webinar will be recorded and archived so you can access it in a few weeks after today's live presentation. The archived webinar will be posted on EPA's NPDES training page at www.epa.gov/npdes/training. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Greg Shaner has been an attorney advisor with EPA for the last 9 years. In addition to leading the EPA team that issued the 2012 CGP, Greg led the reissuance of the final MSGP, or Industrial Stormwater Permit, in 2008, and worked on EPA's construction general permits that were issued in 2003 and 2008. Prior to joining EPA, Greg worked for the state of Maryland's Chesapeake Bay Critical Area Commission, the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, and an environmental consulting firm. He has a law degree from the University of Maryland and a master's degree from Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. Erica Ferris will be our other speaker today, and she works in EPA's Office of Wastewater Management as an environmental scientist. Erica supported the reissuance of EPA's 2012 Construction General Permit and also works on the EPA stormwater rulemaking effort. Erica graduated with her MA degree in Urban Affairs and Public Policy in 2009 from the University of Delaware and also holds a BS degree in Natural Resources Management. One final note before we get started with our first speaker. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible throughout this webinar. However, due to the high number of participants, not all your questions will be answered. Please view the permit, fact sheet, and additional guidance about the Construction General Permit on EPA's website at www.epa.gov/npdes/stormwater/CGP. If you have any questions, you can email cgp@epa.gov. Now I'll turn it over to Greg to start the presentation.
Thanks, John, and welcome everyone online and on the phone. So today we are going to go over the 2012 Construction General Permit, and in general we would like to give you a quick survey of everything from how to obtain permit coverage as well as a good highlight of the new requirements in the permit, and also how to terminate permit coverage at the end. So hopefully this presentation is useful if you're a prospective permittee or a member of the public, permitting authority, this is a good overview of the permit. And in the same way, it is not a substitute for reading the actual permit, where there's certainly going to be some of the details and some of the specific provisions we just won't have enough of an opportunity to go over. So to start off with a little background to construction permitting in general, just to give everyone a good starting point. You all probably are aware that the EPA regulations require permit coverage, and that is a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, permit for land disturbances of one or more acres of land. It's also permits also required for those smaller disturbances that are part of a common plan of development or sale, typically in a residential type of project where those add up to more than 1 acre. Those would also require permit coverage. The typical way that construction projects are covered, and again, this is for stormwater discharges from those construction projects, is to obtain coverage under what's called a CGP, or Construction General Permit. And getting permit coverage is typically a matter of submitting what's called a Notice of Intent, or NOI, and we'll be going over that in a little bit. CGPs, whether they're issued by EPA or the states, typically follow somewhat of a standard format. The requirement for the construction operator is to implement and maintain stormwater controls, or what's called best management practices, to prepare a site-specific stormwater pollution prevention plan, or SWIP, where the specific controls are described as well as other aspects of the site are described. Also to conduct self-inspections of the site and to perform maintenance on those BMPs. And lastly, to include documentation in your records as to compliance with the permit. Recently, in February 2010, EPA finalized a set of effluent limits for the construction and development industry, referred to as the C&D rule. These rules became effective again in February 1st, 2010, and after this date, any EPA or state-issued construction stormwater permit will need to incorporate those C&D rule requirements. And so I think from an overview standpoint, it's useful to go into a little bit of detail on what the C&D rule is. When the rule was first issued, it consisted of two components. The first component was a set of non-numeric requirements that apply to all construction sites. And there was also a numeric component that applied to sites that disturb 10 or more acres. For that specific, the numeric limit, this was a limit on turbidity. You may be familiar with the 280 NTU limit. In January 4th of 2011, EPA, after finding that there was underlying errors in the interpretation of data, stayed the limit. In other words, it indefinitely pulled the limit out of the rule, so it was no longer required to be incorporated into EPA's or state permits. This past January, EPA requested additional data on the effectiveness of different controls relating to turbidity from construction sites, and the purpose of this is to look into more current data that might support a numeric limit down the road. And EPA thanks those of you who submitted comments and data and other information, and we'll be evaluating that data moving forward. So now, just to focus on the first component of the C&D rule, the non-numeric effluent limits. These, again, are the component of the C&D rule that's effective and required to be implemented in permits. There's first a set of erosion and sediment controls that are included in those limits, and several of them require that aspects of stormwater discharges be minimized, and those include minimizing sediment discharge, minimizing soil exposed, minimizing steep slope disturbances and soil compaction. And what's unique about these requirements is that EPA intentionally left the specific details as to what the permitting authority might mean by minimizing sediment discharge, say, to the permitting authority. And for that reason, as we'll be talking about later, EPA took what the language from the C&D rule and elaborated in the permit on what kinds of measures, what kinds of procedures should be implemented to comply with that limit. The C&D rule also required that state or EPA permits control volume to minimize erosion, to also provide natural buffers around surface waters unless infeasible. And Erica's going to be going over that in greater detail in a little bit. The rule also included a requirement that if you're using sediment basins or ponds, that outlet structures be used to withdraw water from the surface so that the less sediment-laden, less turbid waters be discharged instead of the waters from the bottom where most of the sediment is. In addition, the non-numeric effluent limits required that state and EPA permits include site stabilization requirements, and here the requirement is that stabilization be initiated immediately if construction work temporarily or permanently ceases. And in the regulation, it defines a temporary stop of work in an area as one that lasts 14 or more days. So if there is a temporary stop of work in that area for 14 or more days, stabilization would need to be initiated immediately. The rule also directs permitting authorities to establish deadlines for when stabilization needs to be completed, and also establish some recognition that alternative requirements may be necessary for arid, semi-arid, and drought-stricken areas. And then lastly, in the C&D rule, there's a set of requirements related to pollution prevention. And here the requirements are geared towards minimizing stormwater exposure to construction materials, products, and wastes. In addition, there's a set of pollution sources that are prohibited, or discharges from those pollution sources are prohibited, such as fuels and oils from vehicle and equipment O&M. Okay, so that's the C&D rule, and again, that became effective in February of 2010. So states and EPA need to incorporate those limits as their existing permits that were issued before that date expire. And EPA's permit, as we'll be talking about, expired recently, so there was a requirement on EPA to incorporate these new requirements. EPA's new CGP, which was issued February 16th, only applies to those areas of the country where that do not have NPDES permitting authority. And we've listed these here, but they include Idaho, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Mexico, DC, Puerto Rico, and all other U.S. territories. It also includes most Indian lands as well. States that have their own permitting authority are required to issue their own CGPs, and many of the states that issue CGPs follow or appear to follow a similar format and content as EPA's CGP. So by going over EPA's permit today, it's likely that you'll be informed. For those of you that are in other states, will be informed about some of the provisions that your state may be looking at. So just a little bit more background on the 2012 CGP. It replaces its predecessor, which was the 2008 CGP, which expired February 15th. The new CGP went final February 16th of this year and will expire in 5 years in 2017. It provides coverage for all new and existing construction projects. There's several modifications. Most notably, in this permit as compared to the previous permit, the new C&D rule requirements have been incorporated. and we'll be getting into that in a little bit. There's also new protections for impaired and sensitive waters, as well as enhancements that we believe have made the permit more readable and clear. Okay, so in this section we're gonna start by getting into the requirements of the 2012 CGP and starting with how to obtain permit coverage. And for a lot of you out there that are construction operators, this will be your first significant interaction with the permit, is obviously how to get covered under the permit. So we've broken this down into a series of steps which we think makes sense. The very first is obviously to determine if you are eligible for permit coverage. And so to be covered by the CGP, you need to meet some of these initial eligibility requirements. The first requirement is that you are an operator of a construction project, and the operator includes both the traditional general contractor as well as the owner of the project, and the owner being someone who has control over the project design and specifications. Both entities, and sometimes they may be the same entity, but often are different, will be required to apply for coverage. So the first thing is, if you're an operator of a construction project, your project is disturbing 1 or more acres of land, or you're part of one of these residential subdivision projects that are less than an acre but add up to the whole project adds up to more than an acre. In addition, you're in one of these areas that I summarized before where EPA is the permitting authority. And then there's also a set of eligibility requirements that apply in addition to the first three. For instance, pardon me, a requirement to meet endangered and threatened species requirements, historic property requirements, as well as to have, if you're going to be using treatment chemicals of a type called cationic treatment chemicals, you're subject to additional requirements. I also wanted to note that the CGP, the new CGP, did not affect in any way the underlying statutory and regulatory requirements affecting who needs permit coverage. So for instance, we received a number of questions from the oil and gas industry about whether the exemption that's in the regulations still applies, and the answer is yes, that the CGP issue did not affect in any way those requirements. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on a few of the eligibility requirements. First, the endangered and threatened species eligibility requirements. Here, EPA is affected by the Endangered Species Act, and there's a section in that act that requires whenever the federal government takes an action, and which includes something like issuing the construction general permit, we need to comply with the ESA. And we've done that by establishing a process that operators need to go through, is kind of a screening process to determine whether, first of all, there's any species or critical habitat in their action area. And the action area is pretty much defined as the discharge itself of stormwater, as well as the site itself. And to find out information on whether species exist in your county, there are two links here that link into both the Fish and Wildlife Service's endangered species lists, as well as the National Marine Fisheries Service list of endangered and threatened fish habitat. So if you've gone through that and you've determined that you don't have species in your county, there's a way to certify that. But if there are, then the permit asks you to determine whether it can be concluded that the site's discharges or related activities are not likely to adversely affect listed species. And there's 6 eligibility criteria that you can pick from. I won't go into that, but if you refer to Appendix D of the CGP, there's detailed instructions on how to do that. When you get to filling out your NOI form, it asks for additional information to support the conclusion. So for instance, if you indicate that there's species or habitat on your site or near your site that you're not likely to adversely affect them, the NOI form asks you to include the basis for your conclusion, what species or critical habitat exists, and the distance between your site and the species or critical habitat. I also mentioned historic properties as a requirement for obtaining permit coverage. And here, EPA is affected in a similar way to the ESA to something that's called the National Historic Preservation Act. And in complying with that act, EPA has established a screening process in Appendix E of the permit that focuses on those kind of earth-disturbing activities that could potentially affect historic properties. And we've narrowed the focus of the requirement so that operators would only need to look into potential historic property impacts if they're installing stormwater controls such as a pond or culvert or channel that cause subsurface earth disturbance. If that's the case, you would follow the screening process in Appendix E, which asks, among other things, will the installation of controls have an effect on those historic properties? You could answer no by looking into various sources in your area, or if the site in general has already undergone a historic screening process for some other reason, that would be a valid basis. But you'd be able to indicate in your NOI that there are no historic properties present. Alternatively, if there were and there potential effects could exist, you would need to contact the state or tribal historic preservation program and provide them a minimum of 15 days to take a look at the information you've provided them, and we've spelled that out in Appendix E. And then indicate after those 15 days what the nature of their response was, whether they got back to you and indicated no problem, whether they provided recommendations on mitigation measures, or whether they didn't respond. So that's the historic property requirements, and I think I'm going to take a quick break and see if we have any questions on the first set of material.
We do, Greg. One question was if the owner and operator are separate entities, do both the owner and operator need to submit an NOI for permit coverage?
Good question. The answer in this case would be yes, that both entities would require permit coverage, and this relates to our definition of what a quote-unquote operator is in Appendix A of the permit. So I would suggest people look at that definition. We also include that same definition in Part 1 of the permit right up front that indicates that both entities would require permit coverage.
And I guess a related question on that, if they are separate entities, the owner and operator, do they need to develop separate SWIPs, or can they develop one SWIP?
Right, so they would both require permit coverage, but there would not. There is a great deal of flexibility on developing a joint SWIP. I'll be getting into the requirements for the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, but that kind of coordination is actually encouraged as long as the different responsibilities that might shake out between the owner and the operator are spelled out in the SWIP, and it's pretty clear.
Let's just take one more question since you were just touching on them. The ESA and historic properties requirements, are those unique to EPA's CGP, or do those also apply in state-issued permits?
This is unique to EPA as a federal agency's requirements. There are a select few states that have their own requirements that affect their own list of endangered or threatened species under state requirements, but it is not a requirement of the ESA that be incorporated like it is for the CGP. I'm not aware that there are state CGPs out there that deal with historic property requirements, though. Okay, so thanks for the questions. So carrying on with how to obtain permit coverage, and we dealt with step one, which is a consideration of whether you're eligible for permit coverage, and assuming you are, the next step would be to develop a stormwater pollution prevention plan, or SWIP, which we were just talking about. SWIPs are required to be developed prior to the notice of intent being submitted for permit coverage. So for that reason, this is the next step here. The SWIP in general includes information on the sequence and estimated dates of construction activities, the requirement to develop a site map that details various features of the construction disturbance, nearby surface waters, nearby sewer inlets, and similar information. Also, the SWIP is required to include a description of the stormwater controls that will be used and document pollution prevention procedures that comply with the permit, and to also document procedures for inspecting, maintaining stormwater controls, as well as taking corrective action. So just to give you a little bit more information on the SWIP, we have a variety of tools that we've developed over the years and updated recently to help you develop a SWIP. We just last week updated the SWIP template that's available online, and this is a snapshot of where to find this. This is our SWIP page, but the template is a useful tool because it's a Word document that can be customized, and it complies with all the SWIP requirements in Part 5 of the Construction General Permit. We're also going to be updating our SWIP guide, which is pictured to the right here, the top document there. The SWIP guide needs to be updated with some references. It still can be used, by the way, as a good overall tool for an overview of construction stormwater, as well as good tips on BMPs and how to develop a SWIP in general. We'll also be putting out some sample SWIPs as good kind of visual examples of what EPA considers to be exemplary SWIPs for different kinds of construction projects. And in the next month or two, we'll be putting out sample inspection and corrective action reporting forms. So hopefully that will be useful. And with respect to the inspection and corrective action reporting forms, if you know of any out there that you've developed yourself or that you're aware of that you think work well in the field, we'd be interested in seeing them. So I'd encourage you to email us copies at the CGP email box, which is cgp@epa.gov. Okay, so we've developed the SWIP, and now it's the next step here is to submit the NOI to get permit coverage, and here is a table from the permit showing what the different deadlines are for submitting the NOI, and those basically break down to whether you're a new project, existing project, or emergency-related project. For a new project, and those are any that began after February 16th, the basic requirement is to submit your NOI at least 14 days prior to commencing construction. The 14 days arises from this whole process we were going over with the Endangered Species Act, and here where you submitted your NOI, the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service will be able to look at your NOI and ask questions to us or to the operator. But if nothing else happens in that 14-day waiting period, your project is automatically authorized. If you're one of the existing projects that was covered under the previous permit and will continue under the new permit, and it will continue past May 16th, we wanted to give 90 days to existing projects to submit NOI. So if your project will continue after May 16th, the requirement is to submit the NOI by no later than that date. We've also created a category of projects that are emergency related, and these are defined in the permit as those that cause that are the result of a severe catastrophic event or some other community-wide disaster where construction needs to begin immediately to provide community services. And for that reason, the permit provides immediate coverage to those construction projects without the need to submit an NOI. However, after commencing construction within 30 days, they'd need to submit an NOI. The vast majority of NOIs that we handle come in through our electronic system, which is referred to as the ENOI system. The ENOI system is something that we require to be used in the permit. However, we've allowed regions to, on a case-by-case basis, enable operators to use the paper form if they're having difficulties with the electronic form. Basically, where we've found that the operator will get coverage sooner if they use the electronic process that enables that 14-day waiting period to begin immediately. Just to give you a little bit of background, and for those of you permittees out there or potential permittees, you may want to print some of these pages out later and have at the ready when you apply for coverage. But you would, to start using the ENOI system, you'll need to go to the ENOI website and click on the ENOI icon that's pictured here to the right. And then you'll need to create an account using EPA's CDX system, which is an acronym for Central Data Exchange. But it basically is giving you an account within our system to apply for coverage using the ENOI system. If you've already done this for previous projects, you'll just be logging into your existing account. Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky, in that the process differs just a little bit between whether you've already created an account or not. And so for operators that have already submitted an ENOI under the 2008 CGP, you'll log on to your existing account, and then you'll no longer be able to use the ENOI, the SWENI or ENOI or Stormwater ENOI program, as that's been disabled. So you'll need to add what's now called the electronic NOI to your account profile. And there's a process that you'll go through to do that. There's also a tutorial on our ENOI page, which I'd recommend you opening up and paging through, which it kind of walks you through the different procedures here. After you've done this, you'll be able to apply for coverage under the new permit. If you're a brand new operator that's never used the system, you'll need to create a CDX account, and similarly, you'll need to add the electronic NOI function to your account profile, and then you'll be ready to apply for coverage. So again, sorry to hit you with this very process-oriented information, but for those of you who are going to be using it, you might want to print this out and have as kind of a tip sheet to use. And then lastly, you're on the system, you're filling out your NOI. What's basically required in the NOI is it can be viewed in paper form in the permit itself. There's a paper NOI, but once you go through the ENOI system, it takes you through the same information by asking for information that identifies you as the operator, where your project and site is, where you're discharging to, and here we're specifically interested in finding out what surface waters you're discharging to, and if there's any surface waters on or near your site. There is a tool that will be available shortly in the ENOI system that enables you to map this yourself. There's also if you Google My Waters, you can find a tool that's on EPA's own website that you can use as well for this information. We'll also be asking information on whether you're going to be using chemicals or not on your site, and also information about the SWIPs, endangered species, and historic preservation. Okay, so you've now gone through the NOI process. You've gotten coverage. The last thing to go over is prior to actually commencing construction, there's requirements in the permit that any personnel on your site that will be at all involved in complying with the permit will need to have a somewhat basic understanding of the permit's requirements and their specific responsibilities. And this will likely be spelled out in the SWIP. Anyone who's involved in compliance with the permit should be identified in the SWIP, and their responsibilities also identified. But at a minimum, those personnel need to have a basic understanding of where the stormwater controls are and how to maintain them, procedures that are in effect for pollution prevention, and also the procedures for conducting inspections, recording findings of those inspections, and taking corrective action. And with that, I think we're going to take some questions.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, we'll just take 2 or 3 real quick questions so we can get back into the slides. Greg, we got a couple of people asking when the 2012 CGP will be in effect for Idaho. That's one of the 4 states that EPA issues the CGP in, and that's, I believe it's not effective there yet.
Right. All the states that we issue permits for are required to undergo what's called the Clean Water Act 401 certification process, where they're essentially looking at how protective our permit is related to their water quality standards. And Idaho has not yet completed their 401 cert process, so we're not able to provide coverage for Idaho. But from what I hear, they will be up and running sometime in early May.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, can you describe the process for an existing project that was it had coverage under either the 2003 or 2008 CGP to obtain coverage under this current CGP? Do they need to submit an NOT or an NOI?
Yeah, the answer to that question is that if you're shifting over from a 2008 permit to the 2012 permit, you would only need to submit the NOI for the new permit. You would not need to submit an NOT. And just to go back for a second to that Idaho question, because I want to make sure I got that right. I may be wrong about that. It may be mid-April, but I need to check in with the state again. And just to clarify, EPA will be establishing permit coverage for facilities in Idaho almost instantaneously. We're able to get that permit live when we hear back from the state.
All right, let's turn it over to Eric to talk about the erosion and sediment control issues in the permit.
Thanks, John. So the next area, as John mentioned, is the erosion and sediment control requirements, and this is a major chunk of the permit where we have implemented many of the C&D rule requirements that Greg mentioned earlier. And in this section, we're really highlighting some of the major new requirements, so you'll want to go through and read the permit to get the details about all of these requirements. So first I'll touch on the installation and maintenance requirements for erosion and sediment controls. The permit requires that you install all of your stormwater controls to treat disturbance at the time or before those disturbance occurs for each phase of construction disturbance. You're required to install stormwater controls along all perimeter areas of the site that will receive stormwater from your disturbances. And these are typically going to be your silt fences. And then as construction progresses in each phase, you'll need to install your remaining stormwater controls to treat the disturbances that are occurring. that occur. To ensure that your controls remain effective throughout your period of permit coverage, the permit requires that stormwater controls be maintained. So if at any time you discover through an inspection or otherwise that a stormwater control needs to be repaired or replaced, you're required to immediately start work to fix the problem if it's something that can be easily fixed, such as the picture you see here, the silt fence has been blown down. And then you're required to complete work to fix easy fixes by the end of the next workday. And the permit actually includes specific maintenance triggers for certain controls. For inlet protection, you're required to remove accumulated sediment. And for perimeter controls, you're required to remove sediment once it's reached half the height of the perimeter control. And then for more significant repairs, such as needing to replace or repair a stormwater control, a significant repair, the permit has more flexibility. You're required to complete work to repair or replace the control within 7 days. However, if it's not feasible to do it within 7 days because you're not able to get the person on site to fix the control, or it's taking more time to have the control, a new control installed, you have flexibility beyond the 7 days, but you're required to provide documentation in your SWIP for the reason why you can't meet the 7-day time frame and what your new time frame is. So next I'm going to get into new requirements in the permit for providing and maintaining natural buffers. This is a significant new requirement that you may have questions about. It implements the C&D rule requirement, which stated that permits must have requirements for permittees to provide and maintain natural buffers around surface waters unless infeasible. And we spent a lot of time in implementing this requirement in the permit in figuring out whether we needed to add specificity to this. So I'll go over how we ended up implementing this in the permit. So in coming up with the buffer provisions in the permit, we looked at several different issues so that we could come up with a requirement that was both environmentally protective and implementable by permittees. So we looked at how effective buffers are at removing sediment and nutrients, and what a minimum size is necessary to achieve high levels of pollutant removal. We also looked at what states and local regulations already say about buffer widths in the areas where we're the permitting authority. And then we looked at whether a uniform buffer width would be an appropriate requirement or whether flexibility would be needed. And we ultimately found that 50 foot is an effective width at removing high levels of sediment, and also is a width that's commonly implemented in many states and local regulations. So in the permit, we determined that the buffer requirements would apply for any sites that have disturbances within 50 feet from a surface water. So here's just a picture of an example of where the buffer requirements would apply. In this example, because the site is disturbing within 30 feet of the surface water, the buffer requirements would apply to them. We did recognize that there is needed flexibility for sites, because not all sites would be able to provide a 50-foot setback between their disturbance and surface waters. And because of this, we came up with 3 compliance alternatives for meeting the buffer requirements in the permit. The first compliance alternative simply requires that if you're subject to the buffer requirements, you can meet the requirements by providing a 50-foot setback between your disturbance and the surface water. However, if for whatever reason you can't provide the full 50-foot buffer, you can provide, in compliance alternative 2, you can provide a buffer of less than 50 feet, but you must provide supplemental erosion and sediment controls that meet the equivalent sediment removal as the 50-foot buffer would achieve. And the third compliance alternative allows sites that aren't able to implement a buffer of any size to comply with the requirement by providing exclusively erosion and sediment controls that would achieve the equivalent sediment reduction as the 50-foot buffer. And just to note, the second and third compliance alternatives, the requirement to implement supplemental erosion and sediment controls are additional controls to the controls that you would normally implement in the permit, such as your perimeter controls. And I'll be providing an example in a couple of slides of how you would go about determining your equivalency. We did, in coming up with the buffer requirements, we recognize there are certain exceptions in which it wouldn't make sense for the buffer requirements to apply. The first exception are situations in which there is no discharge of stormwater from the disturbance to the surface water. So this would be an example of a site where, due to the natural topography, all stormwater flows away from the surface water, or it may all be channelized and flow into the storm sewer system. Or it could include a situation where the operator actually constructs a berm or some other control that would eliminate the chance of stormwater discharging to the surface water. Another exception is situations in which there is no natural buffer on the site at the time you obtain permit coverage. So this would be a site where the buffer has been eliminated from impervious surfaces, such as a concrete walkway that has just removed any natural buffer area. The third exception is disturbances related to water-dependent structures, such as a pier or a boat ramp. Could also include something like a marina, and also construction approved under Clean Water Act 404 permits. We also have special provisions that provide flexibility for certain types of development. For small residential lots, which in the permit are defined as residential disturbances of less than an acre, but are part of a common plan of development, so would be subject to the permit. And for these types of disturbances, we developed, and in our buffer appendix, which is Appendix G, easy to implement compliance alternatives for when a 50-foot buffer is not practicable. And then for linear disturbances, we have special flexibility where if site constraints would limit the ability for you to comply with any of the compliance alternatives, you can achieve compliance by providing a buffer width that is practicable and additional controls if that is practicable. So I'd like to now go through an example of how a site would achieve compliance with the compliance alternatives 2 and 3, which require that you achieve the equivalent sediment removal as the 50-foot buffer. In our buffer guidance, which I mentioned was Appendix G, we have detailed information about how you comply with these compliance alternatives. So here we have a hypothetical example. In this example, a site in New Mexico with a 1.5 acre disturbance that occurs within 50 feet of the surface water finds that they can only provide a 28-foot buffer. And so therefore, they would need to choose compliance alternative 2, which allows you to provide a buffer of less than 50 feet that must be supplemented with additional erosion and sediment controls to achieve the equivalent of a 50-foot buffer. The permit requires that you demonstrate how you achieve the equivalency, and in our buffer guidance, we provide tables that help you figure out what the sediment removal as a 50-foot buffer is, but there's certain site-specific information needed to figure out what this number would be, including the predominant vegetation in the buffer and your predominant soil type. So in this example, the operator determines that their predominant vegetation is prairie grass and predominant soil type is silt. So the first step would be to first estimate the sediment removal that would be achieved if you did provide a 50-foot buffer on the site. And in our buffer appendix, we have several tables that apply to each of the states in areas where this permit is in effect that provide the estimated sediment removal achieved by a 50-foot buffer based on various soil types and vegetation types. And just to note, these tables are provided to help permittees make this determination, but we would also accept calculations that you make on a site-specific basis if you find that the tables don't apply to your site, or if you want to use your own site-specific information. So in this example, the operator previously determined that they have silt soil type and prairie grass vegetation. So looking at the table, they would determine that a 50-foot buffer on their site would achieve a 50% sediment removal. Step 2 would require the operator to next design controls that would meet the equivalent removal as a 50-foot buffer, which in this example was 50%. In our buffer appendix, we used the revised universal soil loss equation model, which is called Russell 2, that's RUSLE2, or LE2, to model what controls would achieve the equivalent removal of the 50-foot buffer for this site. And here you see a picture. We ended up modeling that a 28-foot buffer in combination with the site's perimeter control, the silt fence, and the addition of a fiber roll barrier would achieve an 84% sediment removal, which exceeds the required 50% removal. There are other models that can be used. Whether you use the Russell 2 model or another calculator, you're required as the last step to provide documentation of your SWIP, of the calculations used to achieve the equivalent removal as the 50-foot buffer. Next, I'd like to go through an example of the flexibility we provide to small lots in Appendix G. We actually developed 2 small residential lot compliance alternatives in our appendix. The first is a straightforward approach that simply specifies the controls that a small residential lot would need to implement based on the sediment width or the buffer width that they're retaining on their site. The second is a risk-based approach that specifies the specific controls that would need to be implemented based on the buffer width retained and the site's risk of sediment discharge. And so I'd like to go through an example of how a site would comply with this compliance alternative. So here we have an example of a half-acre site in Massachusetts that is only able to provide a 20-foot buffer. The small residential lot compliance alternative requires some site-specific information as well. You would need to find out what your average site slope is and your predominant soil type. In this example, the operator determines that their average site slope is 3% and predominant soil type is silt. So in Appendix G, our buffer appendix, we developed several tables that provide the relative sediment discharge risk based on a site's average slope and soil type. So the example of this site in Massachusetts, they would, in Appendix G, refer to the table that applies to their average slope. So here, they're in referring to the table for slopes of less than or equal to 3%, they see that because they're in Massachusetts and that their predominant soil type is silt, their sediment discharge risk is moderate. The next step would be to refer to the next table in our appendix, which describes the specific requirements that apply to the site based on their sediment discharge risk and the buffer width that they're retaining. So here, because the site is a moderate risk and because they're retaining a 20-foot buffer, they determine that their additional requirements would be to implement double perimeter controls. And in the appendix, we provide specificity regarding what it means to have to implement a double perimeter control. So now I think we'll do a Q&A break.
All right, thanks, Erica. Erica, the first question asked about the buffer requirements, and asked, does the buffer requirement apply to disturbance in proximity to waters of the U.S. and not to normally dry drainage ditches, et cetera? And I guess that also gets into the definition of water of the U.S. then.
Good question. In the permit, we say that the buffer requirements apply to surface waters, but in our definitions appendix, surface waters are defined as waters of the U.S. So the answer is you are required to comply with the requirements if there is a water of the U.S. within 50 feet of your earth disturbance. I know there might be some questions out there about whether certain waters meet the definition of a water of the U.S. And EPA is actively trying to come up with guidance on waters of the U.S. So for any questions you might have whether a specific surface water in your site is indeed a water of the U.S., I would recommend you to refer to your state agency or EPA region for additional guidance on that.
Eric, in the one example you gave, I believe in the site in New Mexico, the 1.5 acre, do you know what % vegetative cover you assumed that you would have in this example with the prairie grass on silt?
Yeah, that's a good question. The assumption is that on all those numbers in those tables that the buffer is 100% vegetated. So what we were looking at is the behavior of a fully vegetated 50-foot buffer as to set kind of the standard for what the equivalent, what you would need to meet as an equivalent with a combination of natural buffer and controls or with all controls. Hopefully that answers the question.
Next question has to deal with the deadline for maintenance or for fixing repairs. They ask, what is that deadline when you do identify a BMP that needs repair or maintenance? Is it the next day, or is it within a 7-day period, or what is that specific deadline?
For quick things that can be repaired pretty much on the spot, the requirement is that you immediately start the repair and then finish that repair by the end of the next day. But for things that where you may need to have people come on site to fix it, or you may need to actually install something new, the permit requires that be done within 7 days. And then if 7 days isn't possible, there's additional flexibility for situations in which 7 days is not feasible.
We have a question going back to the NOI form. Where do we get information on whether the receiving water body is impaired? This is asked in the new NOI form. Is there a tool on the EPA website for impaired water information?
The ENOI system, in the ENOI system, we are working on implementing this tool that will help you make that determination based on where your site is located. That's currently not available, so another source that you could use until that does become available is the EPA My Waters tool. It's an interactive website you can find by Googling My Waters. And in this tool, it provides comprehensive information on impaired waters. You can zoom to your location and look up what impaired waters exist around your site. And also, if you have any questions, if you can't find that information through online tools, you could always talk to your state agency if you have any questions.
Eric, another buffer question. Is the 50-foot buffer requirement applicable if you divert stormwater flows and do not discharge directly to the surface water?
It in a situation in which there is no discharge to the surface water that's within 50 feet of your earth disturbance, no, the buffer requirements would not apply. You would qualify for the exception. I think it was the first exception that I listed in the presentation. So no, the answer is no.
Great. We'll take probably one more question before we get back in the presentation. Question about training. Can you clarify or explain who needs to be trained on the site and define what type of training they need to receive?
Right. The requirement in the permit is spelled out. This is Part 6 of the permit, and there's a list of personnel who we included that. And for the purposes of the webinar, I was using shorthand for that. But the list of people includes personnel responsible for the design, installation, maintenance, and/or repair of stormwater controls, personnel responsible for the application and storage of treatment chemicals, and personnel responsible for conducting inspections or corrective actions. The training itself is fairly general. What we're asking, rather than specifying a certain certification or classroom hours, is just to ensure that the personnel that I just went over have a working understanding of the permit requirements, so that before things get going on the site, there's an understanding of everyone's individual responsibilities and what the permit requires them to do.
Okay. Greg, I think we'll turn it back to you to start talking about sediment discharge controls.
Okay, thanks, John. So we're picking up again with erosion and sediment control requirements in the permit, and Erica went over the probably largest or the biggest single change from the current permit, the buffer requirements, but also in the C&D rule requirements that the federal standards include are a requirement to minimize sediment discharge as well as to minimize erosion on the site. So there are a set of requirements in the CGP that speak specifically to minimizing sediment discharges and minimizing erosion. So I'll go over a few of these. There's several more than the ones I'll be listing, but one of the more significant ones is the requirement to minimize sediment trackout. And here, the goal is to try to minimize the sediment that is shaken loose from construction vehicles that leave the construction site and onto public road surfaces. So here the permit requires that vehicles be restricted to designated exit points so that they're not using an abundance of exit points that aren't necessary. Also to use appropriate stabilization techniques. And here to the right is a picture from our SWIP guide showing one technique. There's multiple techniques out there that are very effective at removing sediment from vehicle tires and preventing or minimizing sediment trackout. Where trackout does occur, of course, these things aren't 100% foolproof, but where sediment trackout does occur, the requirement is to remove that sediment through whatever means, vacuuming or sweeping, by the end of the workday. In addition, there's requirements geared towards minimizing sediment discharge where soil stockpiles are used on the site. And here the requirements are geared at protecting those piles from contact with stormwater runoff, so creating some kind of barrier so that the runoff is either diverted or prevented from coming into contact, and to provide cover or appropriate temporary stabilization where practicable, so that direct rainfall onto those stockpiles isn't causing sediment runoff. In addition, there are requirements that relate to immediately adjacent sewer inlets, and these are storm sewer inlets that will be adjacent to the site. And here we're looking at minimizing to the greatest extent sediment that's discharged discharged and becoming a very direct discharge to nearby surface waters. And where you can access those inlets, there's a requirement to install protection measures that remove sediment prior to entering the drain. And the exception to this is if that specific drain sewer is connected to some other device like a stormwater pond, which is designed to treat water that goes into the sewer inlet. We did receive a number of concerns about this requirement from commenters that noted that some of these at-grade controls can cause flooding conditions, and for that reason there's a note in the permit that authorizes people to take these controls down if there's flood conditions that are likely to be caused by a rain event. In addition, there's requirements in the permit affecting the use of sediment basins or sediment ponds. These are requirements that appeared in the last permit that relate to sizing of the storm pond, and we include the same requirements, that is the 2-year 24-hour storm, design storm, or the 3,600 cubic feet per acre drain standard. What's new is the C&D rule requirement to utilize outlet structures that withdraw less turbid water from the surface and less infeasible. And here, those are fairly pervasive, and it's unlikely that they're infeasible. We certainly allow in the permit for that to be documented, and not to use them if it's infeasible. Some of the other related requirements that affect the discharge of sediment and minimizing soil erosion is the requirement to minimize the amount of soil exposed at any one time. And here we don't specify a number that we're thinking about in terms of the maximum amount of acres that can be disturbed. It's a general requirement, but also permittees should keep in mind that any area that's opened up and isn't worked on for 14 or more days is affected by the stabilization requirements that I'll be talking about in a minute. There's also requirements to minimize steep slope disturbances and soil compaction, and these are similarly general requirements. So where there are steep slopes on the site, the requirement is to minimize but not eliminate disturbances. So it's left to the professional judgment of the operator how to minimize those disturbances. And with respect to soil compaction, where you're expected to use vegetative stabilization after construction to avoid compacting the soil and thereby impacting the ability for vegetation to become established. And lastly, there's a requirement to direct stormwater on your site to the extent that it exists to areas of natural vegetation as kind of taking advantage of their natural ability to filter stormwater. The next area of erosion and sediment controls that are significant in this permit are requirements affecting the use of treatment chemicals. And if you are going to be using treatment chemicals, which is not uncommon out there, and certainly EPA has seen a rise in the use of these chemicals, and in past permits we've not included requirements other than to store them in a safe way so that minimizes discharges and spills. But here we've added to the requirements so that we have a better sense of how those are being managed. So at a minimum, if you're using some of these chemicals, you will be subject to the requirement to use the site's erosion and sediment controls both prior to and after applying the chemical. And that is to not only minimize the use of the chemical, but also to help ensure that chemical bound up with the sediment is filtered out prior to discharge. In addition, chemicals need to be selected that are suited to the soil type and expected turbidity, pH, and flow rate. And this is information that site operators can get advice on from from vendors out there, and this is typical information that will be available for most chemicals. Also, that chemicals being stored on the site, they need to be stored in such a way that the discharge risk is minimized by using proper cover, containerizing the chemicals, and/or using secondary containment. The chemicals also need to be applied in a consistent manner with state and local requirements, with good engineering practices, and if the chemical supplier has dosage recommendations, to apply consistent with those recommendations. And lastly, to ensure that the personnel who's using and applying those chemicals on site has the appropriate training. Now, I mentioned earlier on that there's a set of chemicals referred to as cationic treatment chemicals that are treated differently under the permit. And if a site intends to use one of these chemicals, and we've included common examples of chitosan and cationic PAM. And PAM is quite pervasive out there in the market. There can be cationic PAM or anionic PAM, and we're only talking about the cationic version of it. But here we've found in studies that these cationic polymers, which are used, again, to reduce turbidity in stormwater, and they're very effective at doing that. The way they work is to chemically bond to the negative charge of the sediment particle. The issue is also that where the chemical is released in some residual form into the aquatic environment, it also has a very strong affinity to fish gills. And so studies have showed that rainbow trout are highly affected, are affected at low levels of these chemicals, and therefore, for that reason, EPA was concerned not only in the proposed permit but in the final permit with how to handle the use of these chemicals. And what we came up with in the final permit was to not, outlaw or prohibit the use of these cationic chemicals, since again they are very effective. And what we're really getting at is how to ensure that they're being used and managed effectively and safely, is that the use of cationic chemicals under our permit is not allowed unless the operator specifically gets approval from EPA. And how this would work is if they intend to use cationic treatment chemicals, they would contact the EPA regional office, and they'll have a list of information that's required of you, and if they authorize the use of cationic chemicals, you'll likely be subject to additional requirements such as maximum dosage rates or residual testing, and those will become part of your permit coverage where necessary. So that's for cationic treatment chemicals. Lastly, there's a set of controls affecting site stabilization, and these are also under the heading of erosion and sediment controls. And the C&D rule, you may recall, included requirements affecting when stabilization needs to be initiated, and it also instructed permitting authorities to establish deadlines for completing stabilization. And in our permit, similarly, we've adopted the requirement that by no later than the end of the next workday, after construction work in an area of the site has stopped either permanently or temporarily, which is defined as a stoppage of 14 or more days, that stabilization be initiated by the end of the next workday. Also, we've defined when we've established when stabilization must be completed, and that is if you're using vegetative stabilization, by no later than 14 days after initiating stabilization, the operator needs to have seeded or planted the area and provided temporary cover to protect the planted area from erosion. And so within 14 days, those steps need to be taken. It's not EPA's expectation that within 14 days there's vegetative establishment, but just that these initial steps be completed. Once established, once the vegetation has grown, it needs to meet the requirement in the permit that it has 70%, that it covers 70% of the stabilized area based on vegetative density. If the site chooses to use non-vegetative controls, the deadline is that by no later than the 14th day after initiating stabilization that the areas that had been disturbed have non-vegetative measures already installed or applied, and that all areas of the exposed soil will be covered. Also in the C&D rule, there was language acknowledging that arid, semi-arid, or drought-stricken areas be subject to potentially more flexible or alternative requirements. And in the CGP, we've established alternative requirements that within 14 days of stopping construction work, that the area, now this applies if you're doing vegetative stabilization. So if you're doing vegetative stabilization in one of these areas where water is scarce, and obviously there's different vegetation that predominates there and is affected by the shortage of water, that within 14 days that you put down non-vegetative stabilization measures. So at least from an erosion standpoint, you've got some basic erosion controls down. And then as soon as conditions allow it on the site, to initiate the planting or seeding of the area, and to document whatever schedule you're following for initiating and completing vegetative stabilization. The requirement in the permit is that within the area be seeded so that within 3 years the 70% cover requirement is met. So those are the collective requirements which EPA has established in a manner that's consistent with the C&D rule. There's also some exceptions for areas that are affected that aren't in one of these dry areas, but they're affected by severe storm events or other uncontrollable or unforeseen circumstances, such as, for instance, severe storm where there's just no way to begin to initiate stabilization yet because of muddy conditions or flooding conditions, or if there's been some unexpected problem in the delivery of materials, in which case the flexibility in the permit is to follow basically the first 3 bullets above that require putting down non-vegetative stabilization measures and then initiating vegetative stabilization as soon as conditions allow. And I think we're going to take some questions.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Since we just talked about it, can you just clarify on the stabilization question, Greg, that the 70% stabilization or cover requirement, what does that entail? Is that the existing vegetation on site? So, for example, a very arid area, what would that 70% look like?
Right. So the 70% requirement applies to the density of vegetation that exists generally in that area. So it wouldn't be expected that it would be, it would look like some area which doesn't support the kind of vegetation that you'd be after, such as a lawn or a forest. If the density of vegetation is, kind of typically this. Whatever it is, you'd be trying to create 70% of that amount, if that makes sense.
Okay. We got a couple of questions. We might as well take them now on more of, again, the application requirements. So, Greg, in terms of Idaho, you mentioned earlier that the permit won't be effective there until late April or May. What are sites supposed to be doing now if they're establishing a project in Idaho under the 2012 CGP?
Right. So Idaho is located in EPA's Region 10, and they're, as a result, closer to the issue. And they've been. I would encourage the questioner to get in touch with Region 10 and go onto our website and find the way to contact them. But essentially, what the situation that people find themselves in is that there's no permit to apply to. So what they need to do, the only available vehicle is an individual permit. So the region is likely to advise that an individual application be filed. And when the permit becomes effective in Idaho, they'll be able to submit an NOI, and hopefully we're just a matter of a month away or so.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Another question came up when Erica was talking about her example in, I believe, Massachusetts on a half-acre project. The question is, I thought the permit only applied to sites greater than 1 acre. Why are smaller lots regulated under the permit?
That's a good question. The permit does only apply to disturbances of 1 acre or more, but that also can include disturbances that are less than 1 acre, but that are part of a common plan of development. So this could be an example of a residential subdivision where the individual lots may be less than 1 acre, but collectively, because the entire disturbance is more than 1 acre, that whole subdivision, including the individual lots, would be subject to the permit. So for the buffer compliance alternatives, when we talk about the small residential lot compliance alternatives, that would only apply to those small residential lots less than 1 acre, but that are subject to the permit because they're part of a common plan of development of greater than 1 acre.
Thanks, Erica. Next question is for Greg. Greg, does EPA plan to amend the permit at a later date with a numeric turbidity limit? And this specifically applies to that C&D discussion you had earlier.
Right, so you'll recall that the numeric limit that was originally issued in the C&D rule has been stayed, so therefore there's no limit that exists for EPA to incorporate in its permit. So when we issued our permit in February, it does not include a numeric limit. Hypothetically, if EPA takes action to finalize a numeric limit in the next 5 years, I think the question is asking, would we open up the permit and modify it to include the numeric limit? And I'm not aware of any plans to do that. And you know, our plan is to allow this permit to last its full 5-year cycle. If a numeric limit comes up in the middle of that, we would include it obviously in the next permit, but we don't have any plan to open up the current permit.
Okay, thanks, Greg. A somewhat related question: when states issue their own construction development permits, they need to be or they need to include the construction development effluent guideline requirements. But when do they need to update their permits to include those non-numeric effluent limits the EPA just included in its permit?
Right. So states that have a permit that was issued prior to February 2010 that are still kind of living out their 5-year permit cycle, and so the latest we should be seeing those reissued is you know, February 2015. So between now and then, there will be states whose permits are expiring, and as a result, they'll be reissuing their CGPs likely, and then the requirement to incorporate the C&D rule requirements would apply.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Next one we'll ask Erica. Erica, for the inlet protection measures, can these be eliminated if the inlets drain to a sediment pond, which is contained on site? In other words, can they use the sediment basin as their control rather than putting inlet protection on each of the individual inlets?
Yes, the permit does provide flexibility where if you are discharging to an inlet that is first directed to, where the water is first directed to a sediment basin, a trap, or other control, you would not need to comply with the requirements to provide inlet protection.
Okay, thank you. I have a question on the filling out the NOI or the ENOI, the electronic system. Can a consultant fill out the ENOI form for an operator client? And I'll repeat that real quick again. Erica, can a consultant go in and fill out the ENOI application for an operator client?
Yes, so certifier can fill out the NOI application for their client. However, the form does need to be signed by the certifier, which would be the operator. So for the paper form, the consultant can fill it out, but must physically give it to the certifier to actually sign with their signature and ink. For the electronic form, the consultant can fill it out electronically, but the system actually will then send it to the certifier electronically to electronically certify.
Okay, thank you. Let's take one more question. For when erosion and sediment control BMPs need to be installed on site, can you describe when those need to be in place? Is it at the time of initial soil disturbance, or is it at some other point in time? When do they need to have erosion and sediment controls in place?
The permit requires that at the time you're conducting a disturbance in any portion of your site, any down gradient controls need to be installed. So if you're opening up first a half acre of disturbance, you would need to have those controls installed at the time that that happens. And then as you expand your disturbance to other parts of the site, those controls would need to be installed as that construction proceeds.
Okay, great. I think we'll turn it back for the last set of slides. We do have one more Q&A break, and again, we encourage everyone to keep submitting their questions. We'll get to as many as we can. We do have a longer Q&A break at the end. I'll turn it back to Erica.
Thanks, John. So the next area of the permit I'll be discussing are the pollution prevention requirements. These also implement many of the new C&D rule requirements that we talked about earlier. The C&D rule included several prohibitions on certain discharges from certain pollutant generating activities, and we have implemented these in the permit. So the permit prohibits certain discharges, which are wastewater from washout of concrete unless managed by an appropriate control, wastewater from washout and cleanout of stucco, paint, form release oils, curing compounds, and other materials unless they're managed by an appropriate control, discharges of fuels, oils, or other pollutants used in the operation and maintenance of vehicles or equipment, discharges of soaps or solvents that are used in vehicle or equipment washing, and any toxic or hazardous substances from a spill or other release. The permit also includes specific standards for minimizing pollutant discharges from certain pollutant generating activities that are common on construction sites, and these standards are also consistent with the new C&D rule pollution prevention requirements. So the permit includes standards for fueling, maintenance, and washing of equipment and vehicles, storage, handling, and disposal of construction products, materials, and waste, and washing of applicators and containers used for paint, concrete, and other materials. And the standards in the permit are primarily related to design and location requirements. The permit requires that you use an effective means to prevent discharges from pollution sources. So this would entail minimizing the exposure by covering or having them over roofs, or using secondary containment or other measures, and providing spill kits to prevent discharges from spills. The permit also requires that for all chemicals you must use leak-proof containers. Chemicals must be located away from surface waters or other inlets, such as stormwater inlets and drainage ways, which could end up in surface waters. And then for any spills that do occur, you must clean them up immediately, and they cannot be cleaned by being hosed down. The next part of the permit we'll be discussing are the new water quality requirements. And these are new requirements that apply only to sites that are discharging to sensitive waters, which are both waters that are impaired and also waters that are considered to be high quality. And these requirements in the permit are to ensure that discharges to sensitive waters do not cause an exceedance of water quality standards. So the water quality requirements only apply if a site discharges to a sensitive water. So the first step to determine if these requirements apply is determine if you discharge to a sensitive water. For discharges to impaired waters, which are waters that are either on the 303D list or waters that have a completed total maximum daily load, or TMDL. As we mentioned earlier, we're developing a tool in the ENOI system that will help you determine if you discharge to an impaired water. There's also, as we mentioned, the My Waters tool, and again, you could consult with your state agency if you're not sure. The water quality requirements of the permit also apply to high-quality waters, which are waters that have been designated as a Tier 2, Tier 2.5, or Tier 3 water. And to determine if you discharge to one of these waters, we created an appendix in our permits, Appendix F, which has a comprehensive list of all high-quality waters in all the areas that the permit covers. The water quality requirements for discharges to sensitive waters include more stringent requirements for stabilization and for inspection. For stabilization, to minimize the amount of exposed soil that could potentially be discharged in stormwater, the permit requires that you complete your stabilization activities within 7 days of stopping construction work instead of the 14, which applies to sites not discharging to sensitive waters. And the more frequent inspection requirements are to ensure that any problems that could lead to a pollutant discharge are identified as soon as possible. So the permit requires that inspections be conducted once every 7 days and within 24 hours of the storm event of a 1/4 inch or greater, which is more stringent than the regular inspection requirements, which I'll discuss in just a bit, which provide the choice between inspection frequencies. And just a note that these stricter requirements only apply to any area of the site that discharges to a sensitive water. So if you have a project that crosses over multiple watersheds and only one part of the site is discharging to the sensitive water, these requirements only apply to that portion of the site. So now I'll get into the inspection and corrective action requirements of the permit. These correspond to parts 4 and 5 of the permit. The inspection frequency in the new permit, the 2012 permit, are very similar to the inspection frequency requirements from the 2008 permit. There's an option of inspecting either once every 7 calendar days or once every 14 calendar days and within 24 hours of a 1/4 inch storm event. The difference in this permit is the 1/4 inch storm trigger was reduced from a 1/2 inch, and the reason for reducing it was we did an analysis and determined that a 1/2 inch did not cover an adequate number of storm events in the areas where the permit was in effect. And some notes on the inspection frequency requirements. Inspections are only required during your site's normal working hours. So if your working hours are Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and you're conducting your inspection once every 7 calendar days, so every Monday, or if you're conducting your inspection frequency according to the schedule where you need to conduct it after a quarter-inch storm event, and if the storm event occurs on your Saturday, you would not be required to conduct that inspection within 24 hours of Saturday. You would wait until your normal working day, which would be Monday, to conduct the inspection. You're not required to conduct inspections if it's unsafe to do so. So if there's extreme weather going on, we wouldn't expect you to be out on the site conducting your inspection. And if you're conducting your inspection according to the schedule of once every 14 days and within 24 hours of a quarter-inch storm event, you must have a method of measuring the rainfall that is occurring. So you would either need to keep a properly maintained rain gauge on your site, or you could obtain weather or rainfall data from a weather station that's representative of your location. Regardless of which method you choose, you need to keep a log of all rainfall data. The permit does have several allowances for reductions in inspection frequency. For any areas of the site that have been stabilized, inspections can be reduced to once per month. For arid, semi-arid, and drought-stricken areas where there's a reduced possibility of pollutant-generating storm events, if your construction is occurring during the seasonally dry period or during the period in which drought is expected to occur, your inspections can be reduced to once per month, but you also would need to inspect within 24 hours if there is a quarter-inch storm event during these times. And then for frozen conditions, if construction is actively occurring and there are frozen conditions on your site, you can reduce your inspections to once per month, or if you've temporarily suspended your construction activities, you can temporarily suspend your inspections up until the point in which thawing conditions start to occur. The areas of your site that you need to inspect during your inspection are any areas of the site that have been disturbed, all controls for stormwater and all pollution prevention measures you've implemented, any areas that you've implemented stabilization measures, all material waste, borrow or equipment storage and maintenance areas, any areas where stormwater is flowing, and all points of discharge from your site. During your inspection, you'll want to check for several different things. When you're checking your stormwater controls, you want to make sure that they're properly installed, are operating, and are working as they're intended to work. You'll want to check to see if you'll need to install a new or modified control. You'll want to check to make sure that there aren't any conditions that could lead to a spill or a leak. And at all points of discharge, you'll want to be looking for any visual signs of erosion or sedimentation that could be attributed to your discharge. And if during your inspection there's a discharge occurring, you'll want to actually examine the quality and characteristics of the discharge, including the color, the odor, whether there's any foam or oil, and you'll want to make sure that your controls are operating effectively during discharge conditions. And if you determine that there are any conditions that could require corrective action, you'll need to take corrective action, and those requirements will be discussed in just a few slides. The permit requires that you complete an inspection report which documents all of your inspections. Within 24 hours of conducting an inspection, you must complete your report and must include the date and the name and the title of the inspector, any of your findings. If you are conducting your inspections after a quarter-inch storm event, you'll want to note the rainfall amount that triggered your inspection. And if you weren't able to inspect your site or a portion of the site because it wasn't safe to do so, you would just need to document this. You would need to have your inspection report signed in accordance with the signatory requirements in the permit, and you'll need to keep current copies of all inspection reports at your site or have it be easily accessible. So as I mentioned, the permit includes new corrective action requirements, and these requirements are triggered after certain triggering conditions, which include situations in which a stormwater control was never installed or wasn't incorrectly installed, situations in which you are not meeting water quality standards, and any time a prohibited discharge occurs. So for any of these triggering conditions, you're required to take corrective action. You're required to immediately take all steps to prevent pollutant discharges until you can implement a permanent solution. And if you find that you need to install a new or modified control, you must do so within seven calendar days from the time you discover the corrective action condition. However, if you can't do this within 7 days, you can do so. You're allotted more time, but you have to provide documentation in your slip of your schedule for completing the repair. So you're also required to complete a corrective action report similar to the inspection report. For any corrective action triggering condition occurring, you're required to, within 24 hours, to document in a report the condition that you identified at your site, the nature of the condition, and the date and time of the condition and how you identified it. Within 7 days of the triggering condition occurring, you must complete a report that says, or that documents any follow-up actions to review the design, installation, and maintenance of controls, a summary of stormwater control modifications taken or to be taken, including the schedule for implementing the changes, and you must take note of whether any SWIP modifications are required. The corrective action reports must be signed according to the signatory requirements, and you must also keep a copy of this report at your site or at an easily accessible location.
Okay, now we're going to, Erica's completed going through the requirements that are imposed on permittees for inspections and corrective actions. When the site gets to a certain point in its development where construction activities have been completed and final stabilization has been met, this is a triggering event for terminating permit coverage, and the permittee would have 30 days after stabilizing the site to actually terminate permit coverage, and I'll go over the ways to do that. There are some other criteria for when terminating permit coverage is required. One of the more common ones is when a project is transferred from one operator to another, and also when coverage under an individual permit is obtained, and this would be a construction site that becomes subject to an alternative permit other than the CGP. In the case of the transfer, the requirement would be for the existing operator to submit the NOT, and for the new operator, 14 days prior to the transfer to submit an NOI for coverage. So what EPA will eventually have is an NOI system that will allow people to submit notices of termination under the new permit. We're still getting that up and running, but there is a paper NOT form that can be used, and that's found at the CGP website. It's a very basic form that requires that the NPDES tracking number that was provided to you when your project was permitted be provided, as well as the basis. One of those three triggering events that requires an NOT be indicated, and then the operator identify him or herself, provide a project address and a certification statement. And at that point, it can be submitted. Just to go back for a second, the paper NOT form can be used at this point without regional approval until we get the NOI system up and running to accept NOTs. So I think with that, we're going to take some additional questions.
Yes, we got a number of questions, Greg. And if you don't mind, Greg, can you go to the next slide, and we'll put up the website and contact information. Okay, before I ask the first question, again, this is the main website if you need copies of the permit, any of the additional guidance, fact sheets. There's copies of the 2 presentations from today and last week, and also we'll post the video and audio of these webcasts up on those same pages. So basically for anything related to EPA's construction general permit, that is your main website. And if you have any questions, feel free to email the CGP or email site right there at cgp@epa.gov. And we'll leave this up for a couple minutes while we ask questions. So let me see here. What about in terms of, again, going back to some of the initial application requirements, how does someone find out if a site is a historic site? Is there resources for them to find out about historic properties?
Right. There is. I would direct people to the appendix in our permit, which kind of lays out the historic properties screening process. That's Appendix E. And I would also suggest that people refer to, there is a organization that's actually a federal agency called the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and there's a list of registered historic properties, but also in every state and most Indian tribes there are officials that are designated as historic preservation leads, and those people can be contacted for requests for information based on your address, and they'll have information to help you. I would start with those programs first.
Okay, we got a couple questions, Erica, about the inspection requirements. What if you do get a 1/4 inch of rain or more, but you don't have a discharge from the site? There's no runoff from your site. Do you still have to do the inspection?
Yes, the inspection requirements apply regardless of the 1/4 inch producing a discharge or not. We feel that it's important to conduct an inspection both during discharge conditions and during other times. It's important that you identify any problems on the site before the discharge occurs. So there's still utility in conducting your inspection, and you would be required to do so anytime there is a 1/4 inch or more if that's the inspection frequency you're complying with.
Okay. We also got a question from our friends down in Puerto Rico. What happens if you do live in a high rainfall area? How do you comply with the 2.5 inches of rain requirement? Do you need to do an inspection after every 2.5 inch rain event, which could occur on a daily basis?
There is the option. The frequency of inspection requirements provides you with the option to either comply with, conduct one inspection every 7 days or once every 14 days and within 24 hours of a 1/4 inch storm event. So if the concern is that in your area a 1/4 inch storm event will require you to be doing too many inspections, you could choose the other inspection frequency. Also, I should note that the permit requires that if there's a 1/4 inch storm event occurring daily, you would not be required to inspect daily, but you would need to be conducting an inspection, let me see here, within 24 hours of the first day of the 1/4 inch storm event occurring and within 24 hours at the end of the storm.
Okay, thanks, Erica. What about in terms of documenting the inspections and signatures? Are they allowed to use electronic signatures on inspection reports now?
The answer to that question is yes. We make provision in the permit for using electronic signatures and electronic record keeping, and discussion of those requirements are in the appendix. I want to say, is it Appendix C? That's the standard conditions. I'm sorry, it is Appendix I. I apologize. In Appendix I, there's in the signatory requirements, there's a specific provision for electronic signatures.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back to some of the control requirements now. Specifically, someone asked on paint washout waters. These are prohibited, but where can they actually be then cleaned on site? How can contractors manage paint washout waters at their construction site? And we're looking up the exact requirement now.
So it's part 2334 of the permit, which specifies what an appropriate control would be to handle paint washout. The permit requires that all washout from paint, concrete, or other materials be directed into a leak-proof container or leak-proof pit, and the pit would need to be designed so that no overflows could occur from storm events occurring.
Okay, thanks, Erica. Question about the stabilization requirements, specifically for those sites that are part of a larger common plan of development or sale, typically your subdivision developments. What are the stabilization requirements for these subdivisions where the individual lots will be undergoing construction, and when does that stabilization requirement start for individual lots?
Right. So it's common for there to be, a handoff from the developer of a residential lot to the purchaser of the lot, and there's very different ways of handling how vegetation or landscaping is established. So I'm not sure if the question was getting at that versus kind of the triggering event, but regardless of the type of construction project, the requirement to immediately initiate would be triggered whenever construction permanently stopped for that lot, or if there was a temporary stoppage of work for 14 or more days. And I would say if the question is getting at what should be done in terms of the vegetation or the landscaping, I would refer to that permittee to the use of non-vegetative controls, to at least put down non-vegetative erosion controls on the area. And there's an explanation of what those requirements are in the permit.
Okay, great. Can you go to the last slide? We still have a couple more minutes for questions, but we do want to give people the participation certificate if you need that. And we're also going to send out a chat with the actual URL link that you can then copy and paste into your browser. So don't forget to download this certificate for participating in today's webinar if you need it. You can copy that link in the chat window into your browser's address bar, and then type in your name and print out a PDF of the certificate. So we do have a couple more minutes for some more questions. Greg or Erica, what's the best method to transfer permit coverage to another operator? For example, transferring to a residential owner or another operator that's taking over part of the coverage.
So the transfer from one operator to the next, this is distinguished from when a permittee, an operator is covered under the permit and is done with their project and is terminating coverage, and they've sold off the project. We're not talking about that here. I think I'm gathering from the question that how do you transfer from one general contractor company to another. There's actually a switch in there. So that's one of the triggers for the existing contractor to terminate coverage. So they would actually submit a notice of termination. The new operator would need to submit an NOI, a notice of intent, 14 days prior to the transfer. So there's an ability in the NOI form to indicate that, and prior to them actually beginning work on the site, they need to have permit coverage.
Greg, we also had a question asking about impaired waters. Are these only for sediment and nutrients, or can impaired water be for other pollutants? Erica, answer
that. I should have mentioned that earlier when I was discussing the requirements. The water quality requirements only apply to sites discharging to waters that are impaired for sediment or sediment-related parameters, or for nutrients including nitrogen or phosphorus. So if you're discharging to a water that's only impaired for something that's not sediment or nutrient-related, the water quality requirements would not apply.
Great, thanks. What about, how does the 2012 CGP apply to linear or utility projects, and how are these requirements modified?
Okay, maybe Eric and I can do a joint one here, but we received a lot of comments from operators that conduct linear projects, and these can range from highway projects to electrical utilities and the like. But these are different from the standard box-like construction, so they're kind of unique in what requirements apply. And we tried to address these comments in a few areas by establishing somewhat, some flexibility in the buffer requirements, in the requirement to install perimeter controls. We've also established alternative we came up with flexibility for how the storage of building products and materials are protected, and specifically in linear projects, where they could have quite substantial amounts of material that is actually not leaching any stormwater contaminants, that they're typically stored outside. And we've noted in the permit that where there is no stormwater contamination that can happen with exposure, that they wouldn't be covered by the requirement, the pollution prevention requirements. So without getting into specifics, I would direct people to the buffer requirements, where we specifically have exceptions for linear projects, as well as the language for perimeter controls.
Great. A question about projects that were covered under the 2008 CGP. Do they need to update their SWIP in order to be covered under the 2012 CGP? And what do they need to do?
Right, good question. What I would say is don't scrap the old SWIP. If you need coverage under the new permit, you would want to start with that existing SWIP, especially if the projects basically remain the same. A lot of the requirements related to the site plan and the description of stormwater controls are very similar to what they used to be. And what I would suggest is, especially if you have that in electric format, is to examine the requirements in Part 7, which is the SWIP requirements of the permit, and update your SWIP where necessary. I would also direct people to the SWIP template, which is on our SWIP site. You can get there by starting off at the CGP website and looking for the SWIP link. But the template would be a good place to look for areas that you don't have, and you could easily add those areas in. We've also added in some flexibility for existing projects that are moving over from the current permit where they find it infeasible to comply with something like the buffer requirement. They're able to document that the infeasibility, because they've already begun construction, they've kind of ruled out by just the nature of where construction occurs, compliance with the buffer requirements, so they're able to document that in the SWIP. So I would take a look at the Part 7 SWIP requirements in the permit, look at the SWIP template, and you should be good to go.
Thank you, everyone. That does conclude our webcast. We wanted to remind you to fill out the webinar evaluation survey, which should soon appear on your screen. Please complete this survey and let us know your thoughts. We do appreciate your feedback as we work to improve these webinars. The archived webcast will be available in a few weeks on the EPA Construction General Permit website. Again, thank you very much for joining us.